This happened to me just last Tuesday, and honestly, I can't get it out of my head. Let me start by giving you a bit of context about my life. I'm a 30-year-old woman living with my fiancé and our 2 dogs. They're both huskies, one's 2 years old, and the other is just a 4-month-old pup. They're adorable and sweet, but they're not exactly the kind of dogs you'd count on to protect you. They don't bark or howl much, they're just super friendly with everyone. Friends and family have walked into our house before without so much as a peep from them. So, it was a typical Tuesday evening around 8 p.m. It was already dark outside and I was home alone since my fiancé had gone out for his hockey game. I was in the bathroom drying my hair with the blow dryer on full blast. Because of the noise, I couldn't hear much else going on in the house. Suddenly, I heard one of the dogs howl. That caught my attention because, as I mentioned, they're usually pretty quiet. I turned off the blow dryer to listen, thinking maybe the dogs were squabbling again. But then I heard something else, a faint knock at the door. And that's when my dogs went absolutely wild. They were barking, howling, and throwing themselves at the bay window so aggressively that I genuinely thought they might break it. I stood there for a moment, frozen, trying to figure out what could be causing this kind of chaos. Maybe it was another dog outside, or a skunk passing by? But I quickly realized this was something different. Curious and a little uneasy, I decided to check what was happening. The bedroom window was the closest spot where I could see the front door without being seen myself. I peeked through the blinds, and there they were. 2 men in black hoodies stood at the door. Now, I'm not trying to make this about appearances, but it was unsettling to see 2 strangers dressed like that on my doorstep at night. They started knocking again, this time louder. That's when my older husky really stepped up. He jumped from the bay window straight to the front door, growling and throwing his entire weight against it. He was acting like a completely different dog, almost like he knew I needed him to be a guard dog in that moment. One of the men jumped back, clearly startled by the commotion, and looked at the other guy. Without a word, they turned and started walking away. I stayed at the window, watching as they walked down the road. What struck me as strange was that they didn't stop at any other houses. They weren't selling anything or leaving flyers. They had come straight to my door, and now they were just leaving. My heart was racing as I grabbed my phone and called my fiancé, telling him to come home as soon as possible. Even after they were gone, I felt shaken. My dogs eventually calmed down, but I couldn't. The whole situation felt so off. Why had they chosen my house? What did they want? I don't have any answers, but one thing's for sure. I'm beyond grateful for my dogs. They might not usually act like guard dogs, but in that moment, they did exactly what I needed them to do. After calling my fiancé, I couldn't just sit still. I double-checked all the locks in the house, making sure the windows were secure too. I even went to the garage to ensure the door there was locked. As I moved through the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The dogs stayed close to me, following my every step, their ears perked up as if they were on high alert. I decided to turn on all the exterior lights around the house, hoping it would make any lurking shadows retreat. While I was at the back door, I glanced at the yard, illuminated by the harsh glare of the floodlights. Everything seemed normal at first, but then I noticed something odd. One of the garbage bins was slightly tipped over. It wasn't much, but it felt out of place. I didn't dare go outside to check. Instead, I made a mental note to tell my fiancé when he got home. Time felt like it was crawling. Every little creak and groan of the house made me jump. I sat on the couch with my phone in hand, scrolling through social media to distract myself, but my mind kept drifting back to those men. Who were they? What if they came back? My dogs were lying at my feet, but every so often, their ears would twitch, and they'd glance toward the door, as if they could hear something I couldn't. Finally, my fiancé arrived home. Seeing him walk through the door felt like a huge weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I explained everything to him, from the faint knock to the dogs going crazy to the 2 men at the door. He listened intently, his face growing more serious with every word. After I finished, he decided to take a quick walk around the property to check for anything unusual. I stayed inside, keeping the dogs close. When he came back, he mentioned that the garbage bin looked like it had been moved, just as I'd noticed earlier. There were also some faint footprints in the dirt near the front porch, but it was hard to tell if they belonged to the men or were from earlier that day. We debated calling the police, but ultimately decided against it since nothing had actually happened. Still, the unease lingered. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see those men standing at the door. I kept hearing the sound of their knocking in my head, louder and louder. My fiancée stayed up with me, reassuring me that we were safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability. The next day, I took some extra precautions. I contacted a security company and scheduled an appointment to have cameras installed around the house. I also picked up some motion-activated lights for the yard. It might have been overkill, but after what happened, I wasn't taking any chances. Looking back, I can't help but wonder what might have happened if my dogs hadn't been there, or if they hadn't reacted the way they did. Maybe the men would have left anyway, but maybe they wouldn't have. It's a thought that makes me shudder. For now, I'm just relieved that things turned out the way they did. Years ago, when I was just 11 years old, I had one of the scariest nights of my life. It was one of those evenings when everything seemed peaceful, until it wasn't. My little brother, who was 7 at the time, and I were home alone. It was about 9 p.m., pitch dark outside, and rain was coming down in sheets. The kind of rain that makes everything seem quieter and louder at the same time. We were in our room, reading books by the warm light of a desk lamp. Our room was right next to the front door, with a big window that had the blinds wide open, letting in glimpses of the stormy night outside. The calm was interrupted by the sound of the doorbell ringing, followed by loud knocking. It startled me, but at first I thought it must be our parents. Then I realized something odd. If it was them, why didn't they just use the garage or their keys? I glanced out the window, expecting to see their car in the driveway, but there was nothing. Just rain cascading down in heavy streams. I started walking toward the door, curiosity and unease growing with every step. As I got closer, I heard a man's voice, loud enough to cut through the sound of the rain. "Would you like some cookies? We're selling Girl Scout cookies," he shouted. The words froze me in my tracks. It didn't make sense. Who sells cookies in the middle of a storm at night without a girl in sight? I'm not sure what I was expecting, but this definitely wasn't it. Instinctively, I checked the peephole, and my stomach dropped. Standing there on the porch was a man, probably in his late 50s, completely alone. No box of cookies, no umbrella, just him, drenched from the rain and waiting on our doorstep. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the locks on the door were the only thing separating us from the stranger. I could feel my heart pounding as I quietly reached out to check the locks, making sure they were secure. I was so sure he could hear the slight clicks and movements as I tested them. The thought of him hearing that sent a wave of unease through me. The man didn't leave. He kept knocking and repeating his line about cookies, his voice firm but unnervingly calm. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. I thought about calling the cops but hesitated. Then, out of nowhere, I remembered. The blinds in our room were still wide open. The light was on, and my little brother was still sitting there, completely engrossed in his book. I turned quickly and froze in the doorway. The man had moved. He was now at the window, his face pressed close to the glass, peering inside. My brother didn't even notice. He was too focused on his book. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I knew I had to act fast. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I reached for the light switch and turned it off. The room went dark instantly, and I ran to the window. In full view of the man, I grabbed the cord and yanked the blinds closed. I didn't dare look at him as I did it, but I could feel his presence on the other side of the glass. It felt suffocating. After closing the blinds, I went through the house, double-checking every single lock and shutting every curtain. I tried to keep my movements quiet, but every little sound seemed deafening to me. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching, even as I moved deeper into the house. My brother, still blissfully unaware, looked at me curiously as I told him to go play in the big closet in the middle of the house. It was one of those closets with no windows, just walls on all sides. I didn't explain why, and thankfully, he didn't ask too many questions. I just told him it was a game, and to stay there for a while. After securing him in the closet, I found myself standing in the hallway, unsure of what to do next. The rain was still pounding outside, and the man hadn't knocked again, but the silence was somehow worse. I stood there, motionless, listening for any sign that he had left. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind made my skin crawl. I thought about calling my parents, but for some reason, I didn't. Maybe it was the fear of admitting how scared I was, or maybe I thought they wouldn't be able to help since they were probably far away. Minutes felt like hours as I waited, barely breathing, straining to hear any sound from outside. Finally, I worked up the courage to peek through a small gap in the blinds of the living room window. My heart was racing as I lifted the edge of the fabric ever so slightly. The porch was empty. He was gone. Even though he had left, the fear didn't. I stayed up all night, sitting on the floor of the hallway with my back against the wall, just in case. My brother eventually fell asleep in the closet, completely oblivious to the terror that had unfolded. When my parents finally came home, I didn't say much. I was too exhausted and overwhelmed to explain what had happened. But even as morning came and the rain stopped, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I spent the next day obsessively checking the locks, peering out the windows, and jumping at every little sound. What haunted me most was the image of him standing at the window, peering inside, as if he were calculating something. Was he just a harmless weirdo, or was there something far more sinister behind his actions? Days turned into weeks, but the unease lingered. My parents eventually noticed my jumpiness and asked if something had happened that night. I gave them a watered-down version of the story, leaving out the part about the man peering into the window. I didn't want to scare them, or maybe I just didn't want to relive it. Even now, years later, the memory feels fresh. Every time I hear the sound of a doorbell late at night or see an unfamiliar figure near my home, my mind flashes back to that man on the porch. What if I hadn't been quick enough to close the blinds? What if he had tried to force his way inside? It's a question that will always linger, a reminder of how fragile safety can feel. To this day, I'm meticulous about locking doors and windows. I've added extra locks and even installed a camera system. But no amount of security can fully erase the fear of that night. It taught me that danger doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes, it's just a quiet knock on the door, a stranger's voice in the rain, and the chilling realization that they're far too close for comfort. This happened in 2019, during my second year of college. I was living in a townhome, about a 10-minute walk from campus. It was a cozy place I shared with two other girls, though at the time, both of them were back at their parents' homes for the holiday. I had stayed behind because I worked in healthcare and was scheduled to work on Christmas. For some background, we used to have a fourth roommate, but things got complicated, and she ended up moving out. The reason? Her boyfriend. He wasn't just a jerk. He was the kind of guy who drained all the air out of a room. He was loud, disrespectful, and worst of all, unpredictable. He had this way of turning up uninvited and staying longer than anyone wanted. What finally broke things was an incident where he got physical with her and verbally abusive toward the rest of us. We gave her an ultimatum. He had to go, or she did. She chose him. I'd tried to help her see the red flags for months, even years, but she was stuck in the cycle. When she left, it wasn't on good terms, and there was this lingering tension that none of us talked about. So fast forward to Christmas Eve. I worked the next day, so I was keeping things low-key, no plans, just me and the quiet house. I locked up the doors, turned off the lights, and headed downstairs to my bedroom. The house was so still that the only sounds were the faint hum of the heater and the occasional creak of the walls as they settled. I crawled into bed, scrolling through TikTok to unwind. It was well past midnight when I finally started to feel sleepy. And that's when I heard it. A sound from upstairs. It was faint, almost easy to miss, but it stopped me in my tracks. It sounded like the scrape of a chair moving across the kitchen floor. I paused, listening. The kitchen was right above my bedroom, but the walls in this place were thin, so it could have been the neighbors. They shared a wall with us, and sometimes I'd hear muffled laughter or the dull thud of footsteps. But then I remembered they'd asked me to grab a package for them while they were away. The neighbors weren't home. I shook it off, convincing myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind rattling something outside. I was just starting to relax when I heard another sound. Closer this time, my bedroom door. The handle turned and the door creaked open, slow and deliberate. In that moment, my brain felt like it froze. Time stretched, and every nerve in my body was on high alert. I remembered something my second-grade teacher had once said about a break-in. She told us if we ever encountered someone in our house, we should pretend to be asleep. But then I realized my phone was lighting up, illuminating my face in the dark. There was no pretending now. Lying there, I saw him, just a shadowy figure in the doorway. My eyes hadn't adjusted yet, but I could make out the shape of a baseball cap. We just stared at each other, neither of us moving. I don't know how long it lasted, maybe 10 seconds, maybe an eternity. Then, without a word, he backed out of the room and shut the door. My heart was pounding so hard it drowned out every other sound. I stayed frozen for a few moments, straining to hear any movement from upstairs. Nothing. Slowly, I reached for my phone and texted the guy I was seeing at the time. I told him someone had broken in, and he snapped me out of my shock. He told me to call the police. When I finally dialed 911, the dispatcher was calm, asking me if I could unlock the front door for the officers. There was no way I was going upstairs alone, so I told her to let them break it down if they had to. Minutes later, I saw flashlights shining through my window, followed by loud knocking and voices identifying themselves as police. They came in and escorted me out of the house while 2 officers searched the place. It felt surreal watching them sweep through the rooms, guns drawn, clearing every corner. They didn't find anyone, and nothing seemed out of place. But then they told me something chilling. The back door was unlocked. There were no signs of forced entry, and I was sure I had locked it earlier. I couldn't shake the feeling that it might have been my old roommate's boyfriend. He basically lived there at one point, so it wouldn't surprise me if he had a key. But why hadn't he taken anything? Why hadn't he done anything? That was the part that haunted me the most. If it wasn't him, then it could have been anyone. And if it was someone random, what had stopped them? That night, I didn't sleep. The guy I was seeing stayed with me, but I kept pacing the house, checking every lock and every corner over and over again. I propped chairs under door handles and stacked heavy objects against them. The next day, I told our landlord what had happened, but she refused to change the locks. She didn't do anything about it for the rest of the time we lived there. Even now, years later, the memory stays with me. I triple-check every door before I go to bed, no matter where I am. I got a dog to ease my anxiety, and I installed a Ring doorbell for extra security. But every once in a while, I think about that night. To the man who broke into my house on Christmas Eve, whoever you are, let's not meet again.